Your Highness, Your Excellencies, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. I think this is a wholly remarkable occasion. Last year, the Abu Dhabi Quality and Conformity Council's opening forum attracted 650 persons as delegates and attendees. This year, registration had to be closed at 1,700 persons. That, I think, is a splendid illustration of the enormous progress that has been made over the course of the past year in advancing both quality infrastructure and the supporting systems that are necessary to enable it in Abu Dhabi. And I think that the QCC deserves an enormous vote of confidence in that regard. As both the Chairman's opening remarks and the video material that you have seen in respect of the Emirates Metrology Institute demonstrate very clearly, that progress is evident in many different ways and substances. And all of those will be explored in the context of this forum. The Chairman has already outlined what you can expect to hear, so I'm not going to go over that material again. But what I think is very important was a decision that was taken by the QCC to look back at the experience of another exemplary small state, that of Singapore, and to inquire what path it had followed in reaching the status of eminence that it has achieved today. For that purpose, it was decided to invite Dr. Steve Lai, who has been part of the road of progression of the Abu Dhabi Quality and Conformance Council since its inception, to come and do the keynote address at the beginning of this conference today. Dr. Lai headed 2 technology divisions at the Singapore Institute of Industrial Research, which was a primary government institution supporting Singapore's earlier industrial development. After that, from 1996 to 2005, he was the Deputy CEO of the newly restructured Standards and Productivity Board of Singapore and the subsequently corporatized PSB Corporation. In 2006, the PSB Corporation was divested to TVU Sud of Germany, and he was appointed CEO of the PSB Academy and of PSB Technologies until 2012. Along the way, he's received a National Public Service Award from Singapore and the Individual Green Leaf Award for Environment in respect for the contributions that he has made. Today, he's a professional consultant, an academic board member of the PSB Academy, and an independent director of a listed multinational company. May I ask you to join us in welcoming Dr. Steve Lai to the podium.
Your Highness, Excellencies, colleagues, friends, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for me and a pleasure to be back in Abu Dhabi since 2004 and 2005. During those early days, I visited Abu Dhabi quite a lot and worked with the DPE then, as it was called, the Department of Planning and Economy, under His Highness Sheikh Hamad, Chairman of the Crown Prince Court, and also member of the EC. So I'm a bit more familiar with Abu Dhabi, but I can see that after 10 years, there have been so many changes. And the work that we did in the early stages of planning and developing the whole plan for QCC, along with His Excellency Hussein, made it sort of quite interesting for me, of course, to see how it's grown over the last 10 years. And we were also happy that our plans were eventually implemented in the form of a decree in March 2009 into now an institution called QCC. But my purpose here really is to first share the Singapore experience. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? And to also share with you some of the insights into the Singapore quality infrastructure. How is it different? And I hope that from this sharing, you could pick and choose and see where you could gain something from it. But please be assured that setting up of a quality infrastructure is always the right thing to do. In previous work that I've done with the World Bank, in fact, the World Bank had a special program looking at setting up what they call MSTQ, and this is the quality infrastructure for different developing countries in the early days. So let me share the Singapore experience as I've walked the talk myself. In the Singapore infrastructure that is linked to quality, we had two key organizations. One was the National Productivity Board, which actually most people don't understand what it did. Because when you talk productivity, they ask, what do you do? That was the main organization training people in quality, quality assurance, quality control, quality circles. And this was done with the help of the Japanese. And this was right in 1969 onwards. The second institution was the Singapore Institute of Standards and Industrial Research. This was more the technical arm that had the standards, the metrology, the testing, the certification, and a lot of technical extension services. These two key organizations were merged in 1996. And the reason for that was to try and bring a more holistic approach to working with industry. We had the soft approach, which is the human resource development, and we had the harder approach, which was the technical arm, doing the certification, doing the testing. And what we found was, very often, if you start talking about conformity assessment, you talk about testing, you talk about metrology, if the people and the industry is not trained, you get suboptimal effects. So it was good that we go together to deliver that support to industry. Next slide, please. This is actually a simplified slide of how the infrastructure works. So if you see at the bottom, the National Productivity Board, NPB, and CISA, we were delivering support to industry on the one side, and then also support to government and the consumer. So it was like 3 for the price of 1. But the other key thing that we realized that was important, and that was set up actually a bit later than the two organizations which were set up officially in 1971, was the NCB, and that was the National Computer Board. And that was when IT started coming in, and we realized that it could make a major contribution to productivity and quality also. So that was another block that was serving both government and industry. In the Singapore economy, the growth of Singapore was driven a lot by the multinational. So you see there NMC, that's the multinational. These are the big companies like Philips, Seagate, Motorola, and all these other big companies that decided to invest in Singapore. The way it was done was that the small and medium-sized enterprises would then support the multinational. So they get contracts from the multinational. And the government will help support the small and medium enterprises in terms of metrology support, in terms of testing support, and in terms of certification and all other technical support. And that way, the small and medium-sized enterprises could grow alongside the multinational. But of course, the multinational also transferred technology to the suppliers, the small and medium-sized enterprises. Next slide, please. This was actually the slide that I pulled out from the proposal we made to DPE in 2005, okay? And this is a similar support. You can see the bottom part is where all the quality testing standards, metrology is, supporting both the public, industry, and government. And on the government side, you have to bear in mind that in Singapore, in the 1980s, we were building a lot of housing for the people in Singapore. And the government procurement was huge. So the testing and certification also supported a lot of the government procurement in housing and development. In fact, Singapore at one time was probably the single largest buyer of just tiles, ceramic tiles, from various buyers worldwide. And they needed a separate technical independent group to do all the verification. And we, CISA, or later on PSB, was the main institution doing it in support of the government. Next slide, please. So if you look at now how this quality infrastructure supported the Singapore development, on the left-hand side, you can see all aspects of quality that was supporting either industry, the infrastructure had gone into supporting industry, to the middle part where we were doing testing and all kinds of material evaluation, and again for industry. As an example, I put in there semiconductor industry. We started having semiconductor industry investing in Singapore. Each of these investments were in the region of at least 1 billion Sing dollars. They had a lot of requirements in testing for very, very pure chemicals, very, very pure solvents. And nobody could do this. There were no local companies that could do it. So PSB took the initiative, along with the government, to set up the system to begin to be able to do it, to support the multinational. And of course, the multinational have to pay the full price. But the infrastructure was created to support industry in that way. So the various sectors of industry, whether it's semiconductor, electronics, precision engineering, they all were supported by PSB in different ways. Okay? In the system certification on the far right, you see ISO there. We were also the earliest to start ISO 9000 in Singapore when the standard was formed. Because we felt that by pushing ISO 9000 into industry and doing the certification, we knew that industry would learn a lot more and practice a lot more quality. And so we started certifying hundreds of them. And we would have annual awards given out by the Minister of Trade and Industry, given out by prominent people to recognize their movement in quality. Next slide, please. So in the product testing, you can also see that we help a lot of companies export. If I give you an example, for instance, in the medical area, if you don't have a national certification scheme to certify a medical product that you develop in UAE, you will not get it sold anywhere in the world. Because the first thing that the importer asks is, do you have a national certification of your product? And if you didn't, the question is, why not? Why can't you even get a national certification? And this was the question always raised by our own industry. We got to have some of this certification first in order to prove that, look, the product is good enough under this specification and standard for our nation. Because importers will ask. And we had metrology. Metrology is fundamental to the whole thing. It is the physical measurement. So it is the physical standard. The written standard is the other part. And without the physical measurement, all your technical measurements will be wrong, or at worst, incorrect. And that can lead to a lot of losses. So one of the major areas that we did a lot of metrology in was just dimensional, very simple, dimensional. We had tool and die industry that need very accurate measurement on their tool and die. And we're talking about micron and submicron measurements. The question asked was, you can probably get this kind of calibration done in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere. Why do you need to do it in Singapore? But what we realized was that whenever the multinationals or our own companies send their equipment overseas to calibrate, by the time they come back with all the vibration, with all the travel and everything, it has drifted. So we need to have expertise in country to provide that traceability to the company and the confidence that their measurements are correct. And so even a simple area like metrology is critical. It is the foundation to all the physical measurements, whether it be electrical, mechanical, and even chemical today. Then standards. Standard was a more difficult thing for even governments to understand in terms of how does the standard really benefit. I will show you 2 slides afterwards how actually the standard works. But typically, we were also looking at creating standards whereby we can have productivity gains. As an example, for instance, we had a lot of logistical sort of transportation of goods in Singapore. The government built warehouses where the goods would be transferred. And we found that the landing area from where the trucks went in had different heights. And that itself created a productivity issue. So we looked island-wide and we started standardizing dimensions. And immediately, it was convenient for everybody, and everybody knew how to set up their sort of equipment or vehicle in order to fit with the delivery. And that is productivity. We looked at the bunker fuel area in Singapore. Singapore is one of the largest bunkering area where we provide fuel to the ships stopping at our port. And there was no standard there. And all kinds of procedure methods were done, and the buyers were totally confused. Although it continued, but it was not productive. Until we came along, we set up a bunkering fuel standard with standard process procedure so the customer knew exactly what to expect. And we even brought that whole standard to ISO to have it turn into an international standard. And that helped us with productivity. And if you are early in the standardization, you have first advantage because you got your infrastructure now set up to compete. But if you don't, you're a much later follower of the standard, then everybody else is already ready. And so standard is quite critical as a competitive tool. Next slide, please. So this is how we look at standard. If you imagine in an organization, in a company, you have this ball of quality. If you look at the bottom, if you don't have a wedge to put the ball, that quality ball is running up and down on this very slippery slope. What you need is a wedge to stick behind the ball so the ball of quality stays steady at a specific standard, at a specific conformance, at a specific reproducibility, and so on. But you cannot let it sit there all the time because you have competition. And therefore, what do? You move it to the next level through innovation, through invention, through specific quality improvement. And once you move it to the next level, you have now to establish again the standards, the conformance, the measurement, and everything else. So you have this wedge that helps you move up this slope, which is very slippery. And if you don't have that wedge, then you're doing what I call 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So you need the wedge to hold you on so that you can climb the next step. Next slide, please. This is another way of looking at it. So you have on the right-hand side the product and services and the kind of conformance you need. And you do your innovation, your R&D, and whatever you want to do to improve on your product or services. But all the time, you need those measurements, standard testing, and everything else in order to conform. And finally, you have to understand the product quality determinants and the service quality determinants. And that's where you begin to say where I'm going to park my product with regards to those determinants. So you need to measure. You need to measure all the time. Next slide. So some of my personal sort of experience going through quality and dealing with industry and government in this. People are the one that control the quality. So you have to make sure that you train your people. You have to train them so that they know what is quality. And you have to build trust. You have to build trust that quality is serious, and we're going to trust our staff, and the customer will trust us in us delivering what we are going to deliver. Just running through, I can see that at the bottom, the business of quality. If you ask most CEOs, they will tell you that I got a quality manager that's in charge. That's the wrong thinking. Quality is everybody's business and not the quality control manager's business. Because he cannot control everything. Because he can control some of the quality in the product, but he cannot control the systems in the organization, the processes in the organization. And that is why quality is not quality assurance. Quality is total quality management in the whole company. And quality is not an objective that, we say, oh, we just want quality. We must link that quality to productivity. We must link that quality to customer satisfaction or customer delight. And as I said earlier, very often, your quality movement inside an organization is one step forward, two steps back initially. Then, with a lot of practice, you are 5 steps forward, 1 step back. Then you have really quality because you need to practice it. Next slide, please. And of course, in any organization, when we talk quality, leadership is key. It must come top down. However, you have some organization where they say, when the boss is not around, we seem to work better. And the reason for that is sometimes the boss insists on a particular solution. And that is sometimes quite dangerous. Because some of the problems have many factors in there. And the boss may or may not know all the factors. And that is why in the Singapore context, when we set up all these quality circles and training, we want the frontline staff to solve some of this problem because they know what is the problem there. And sometimes the bosses don't know all the problems. Okay? The other is the CEO doesn't know everything. Okay? There is a thing called power distance index that psychologists have worked on. In certain countries, one example would be Korea. The bosses are very powerful. And all the staff dare not tell the boss he's wrong. Okay? There is a very curious thing that's happened in the Korean airline in the 1970s. They had a lot of plane crashes. Planes were built by Boeing, Airbus, and always 2 pilots. But in the Korean system, the captain is king. So the co-pilot sometimes did not give the information or dare not give the information. And the problem starts. So the bosses have to understand in certain circumstances, let everybody come back with the answers, with the data, with the solution, and so on. And let them come up with it rather than to push it. And I will just pick up. Okay, the other thing in the organization is we always say no politics, just the work. And this has to be led by the CEO. And we always say also, you must measure performance, whether it's of people, of product, or processes. If you are not measuring it, we always say you're not competing, you're only practicing. And so we measure all the time. And some of the management blind spots that we have experienced is first, outsourcing. Don't outsource your core. Understand what's your core. We outsource to reduce costs, and we do that a lot. In the system approach, you all know that how strong your company is, the weakest link is always there. And very often you'll realize that your weakest link is facing the customer. And we ourselves know that, and we look at that and say, why are we putting our weakest link in front of the customer? And this is a mistake very often companies will make, including when companies go overseas and start up a new institution overseas or a new company overseas. They're not sending their best guy to run that company. And that is a danger, because he's moving into a new place where everything is different. And he's transferring the system that you have overseas. He must be your best guy. Next slide, please. Maybe I want to end with a couple of thoughts on the future of quality. If you look at the 1950s, 60s, we talk about quality almost like the Model T. During the production of the Model T, you don't ask any question. You're given a book and all the instruction is there. You follow the book and you assemble the car. In the 80s, 90s, 2000, we're talking about a more flexible approach to quality. It's almost like a train. The leader is pulling, the engine is pulling the train. The various carriages have some flexibility to turn around corners, to turn around bends, and so on. So that was more a flexible kind of quality. But we are always thinking that in the future, and even now with some companies, we are reaching a point where we got what we call whitewater rafting. I think that should be switched. The photo is the other way. The whitewater rafting situation you're in. In the whitewater rafting, you got no time for command or control. You got no time to say, you tell somebody what he has to do, what is the instruction. You don't have that time. They have to be trained. They have to be there. They must know what to do. It must be in their DNA. Because the noise level is very high, you can't communicate. And the response needed is very fast. You don't have time to sometimes even think. You instinctively need to know what to do. And that is the kind of future challenge that we will face in quality. That quality will be a normal thing that you expect in a company to compete. So this is how I would see the quality changes over time. Next slide, please. So, I've always said quality, 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 but what is the final? The final is, does it lead to a quality of life? So the quality infrastructure, the quality product, the quality services, and all this effort that we put in somehow must lead to a quality of life. And that is an important thing for all CEOs and middle management to think that how is it going to contribute? And not just do quality for the sake of quality. Next slide. And I just wanted to show one more slide. This was the team that just helped set up the plan for QCC some 10 years ago. And we are very glad that it has now come to fruition and we can see how it's growing. And we will continue to share our experience so that the team over here can see the experience and pick and choose, because your circumstances are also very different now from what we were doing 10, 20 years ago. You're wireless now, we were wired before. So you have a frog sort of leaping advantage that we did not have. And in parting, I just want to say that the future for QCC is going to be special, unique, and good. First, you have something which a lot of other quality infrastructure people don't have. You have already studied the hindsight of all the other QCC infrastructures in the world, so you know where and how they're doing. You also have something that's unique, and that is you have many of the regulators sitting on your QC board. And that doesn't normally happen in most of the other countries. So you have a more system-level approach to the whole of your quality infrastructure. With that, I'd like to thank you.
Steve, I'm going to keep you at the podium because I think as a result of time pressure, we have only time for one absolutely critical question to take that most interesting personal and national journey in Singapore into the space that is relevant for this forum at this time. Singapore in 1960 had a per capita GDP of $1,800. Jamaica in 1960 had a per capita GDP of $1,800. Today, the gap between the two is 10 times. The per capita GDP of Jamaica is $5,400. The per capita GDP of Singapore is $54,757, according to the IMF at the end of last year. Do you think that Singapore would have been able to make this remarkable journey of transformation from an under-resourced, small location at the bottom of the Malayan Peninsula to the dominant position that it has acquired today if you had not made the investment in quality infrastructure and the investment in the language of quality as something that inspired all segments of society in the way in which you did?
Sean, I would say definitely we will not have made it. Maybe I'll tell you why. At the peak of our work in 1980, 1990 to 2000, most of our senior staff were working, helping, meeting at least 5 companies a day. Okay, and all these companies, they were asking, what kind of support and help can we get from you technically? All of them were coming to us and saying, look, I got this contract with a multinational. Any support you can give me would help me deliver in some way. So we were like the catalytic push. Because as you know, Singapore is not a technical country. By no measure, we didn't have technology, we didn't have anything, really, other than human resource. And every time the Economic Development Board, which was in charge of bringing foreign direct investment into Singapore, every time a multinational came, a new investment came, the EDB will introduce them to us. They'll say, look, this is the kind of infrastructure we've set up, and this is how serious we are about quality, about productivity, about improvement. These are all the measurement standards that we deal with and how we translate it to suppliers, how we translate to you. And we will then ask, are there any other technical measurements and certification that you need that we could be ahead of time developing them? And they will say, yes, we have a few here. They'll say, wow. And very often when they leave us, the thing they remember is Singapore is serious about quality.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that makes the point.
Thank you.